While my son was fixing the fence, he accidentally destroyed my difficult neighbor's favorite peony bush. The old man was furious, but that evening he came and knocked on my door, not to talk about the flowers, but to talk about my son. What he told me left me frozen in silence. In that moment, I understood everything, and I realized that I was no longer safe inside my own home. I appreciate you being here. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your city or country. I'd love to see how far this reaches. Please note some elements in this story are shaped for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarities to real people or places are purely coincidental, but the message may still resonate. The cold never really leaves Cedar Falls in March. It just softens, pulls back like a reluctant guest who isn't quite ready to go home. The snow had melted off the front yard by the time I carried my coffee out to the porch that morning, but the air still held that particular chill that settles into a man's bones when he's been living alone long enough to stop fighting it. I set both mugs down on the small wicker table beside my chair. One for me, one out of habit. 3 years, and I still made 2 cups every morning. Dorothea used to say Cedar Falls was the kind of town that forgave you for being ordinary. She meant it as a compliment. She loved the wide, quiet streets, the way neighbors waved from their driveways, without feeling obligated to stop and talk, the smell of the soil when spring finally committed to showing up. She planted things everywhere along the fence line beside the front steps in clay pots. She lined up on this very porch, like a small, cheerful army. Most of them were gone now. I wasn't much of a gardener, but I kept the porch, kept the chair, kept the ritual of 2 cups, and the early morning silence that felt on good days like a kind of company. From where I sat, I could see the edge of Herbert Caulfield's property. Herbert was 79 years old, had lived next door for as long as I could remember, and was by general neighborhood consensus not what you'd call a warm man. He didn't wave from the driveway. He didn't come to block parties. He moved through his days with the deliberate quiet of someone who had long ago decided that most conversation wasn't worth the effort. But that man's garden was something else entirely. Along the shared fence line, he had cultivated a peony bush that I can only describe as extraordinary. It wasn't blooming yet. March in Iowa doesn't allow for that kind of optimism, but even dormant, the plant had a presence. The canes were thick and carefully trained. The mulch around the base was tended with a precision that bordered on devotion. I'd watched Herbert out there on his knees in the early mornings, working around it with a focus that made me wonder sometimes what that plant meant to him. Whatever it wasn't casual. I was still watching the frost on his fence posts melt when I heard footsteps on the sidewalk. Connie Hartfield was 63, recently retired from the county school district, and constitutionally incapable of passing a neighbor's house without stopping. She had a good heart, and an even better memory for detail, the kind of woman who remembered your birthday, your doctor's appointment, and the name of the casserole she'd brought you 4 years ago. Morning, Warren. She paused at my front gate, tightening her scarf against the wind. Cold one still. Getting there, I said. She smiled, and then something shifted in her expression. The slight warmth that comes with delivering good news. You know, I ran into Mitchell last week, outside the pharmacy. She tilted her head. He was asking me about estate planning services. For you. Wanted to know what resources were available in town, whether there were any local advisors he should look into. I felt something loosen in my chest. He didn't mention that to me. That's what I mean, Connie said. He's not doing it to get credit. He was looking out for you. She shrugged like it was simple. You raised a good one, Warren. After she walked on, I sat with that for a while. My coffee was going cold, and I didn't care. Mitchell was 31 now, out in the world building his life with Amber and still thinking about me, still making sure I was taken care of. Dorothea would have cried hearing that. She always said the proof of a parent was in the quiet things, not the grand gestures, but the ones nobody saw. They arrived early that afternoon. Mitchell pulled into the driveway. In that practical, sensible way, he had no fanfare, no announcement, just the familiar sound of his car, and then the front door opening and his voice calling out that they were here. He was tall like me, with his mother's dark eyes and a handshake that had gotten firmer every year since he turned 25. There was something composed about Mitchell. Always had been a steadiness that made other people feel settled, just being around him. Amber was 29, 2 years younger than Mitchell. With light brown hair she kept pulled back, and a smile that came easily and meant it. She went straight for the kitchen, the way she always did, pulling things out of the bags she'd brought with a quiet efficiency that reminded me achingly of Dorothea. She knew where everything was in my house. She'd learned the layout years ago and never forgotten. "Sit down, Warren," she called from the kitchen. "You don't need to help." I sat. Dinner that evening was the best I'd had since Christmas. Amber had made chicken with herbs and a side of roasted vegetables, the kind of meal that tastes like someone thought about it. Mitchell fixed the loose hinge on the back door I'd been ignoring since November. We ate at the kitchen table, and for a few hours the house felt the way it used to, full, warm, inhabited. After dinner, Amber made tea. She moved through the kitchen with that same quiet ease, filling the kettle, selecting a tin from the canvas bag she'd brought. The tea was herbal, something she said was good for sleep, good for circulation, better than the instant stuff I kept in the cabinet. She poured it herself and brought it to me, both hands around the mug, that smile steady and warm. "It's a blend I found," she said. "Just try it. You'll sleep better than you have in months." I thanked her and drank it, while Mitchell talked about work, about the drive up, about nothing in particular. The conversation was easy, and I let myself settle into it, the way you settle into a familiar chair. At some point, I looked up and caught Mitchell watching me. It was just a moment, his eyes on the mug in my hands, something moving across his face so briefly that it was gone before I could name it. I filed it away without thinking. I told myself it was affection, the quiet kind, the kind his mother had taught him. I told myself it looked exactly like love. That night I went to bed earlier than usual. The warmth of the meal, the tea, the company, it all settled over me like weight. I barely made it through 2 pages of the novel on my nightstand before I felt the heaviness come thick and absolute, pulling me under faster than sleep usually did. It wasn't unpleasant, just deep. A darkness with no edges, no dreams, no stirring, until the gray morning light found me still in the same position I'd started in. I lay there for a moment, blinking at the ceiling. Must be the cold, I thought. Must be the age. I didn't know, lying there in the early quiet of a March morning in Cedar Falls, that this was only the first night. I didn't know that the warmth I'd felt at that table, the pride I'd carried from what Connie told me, the gratitude I had for a son who seemed to think of everything I didn't know, that all of it was something I would have to learn to carry differently. I only knew that for the first time in 3 years I hadn't dreamed of Dorothea, and somehow that felt like the strangest loss of all. Saturday arrived with a sky the color of old pewter and a wind that hadn't decided yet whether it was still winter or trying to be something else. I'd slept later than usual. That heavy, dreamless sleep had carried over into the morning in a way that left me slower than I liked. Moving through the kitchen with the careful deliberateness of a man who wasn't entirely sure his legs had caught up with the rest of him. Mitchell was already outside by the time I got my coffee. He'd pulled on his work jacket and found the old toolbox I kept in the garage, and he was crouching by the south side of the fence where 2 of the wooden posts had been leaning since last November. I'd meant to fix them in the fall. Then winter came, and meaning to became meaning to eventually, and eventually had a way of stretching out into spring without much complaint from anyone. I settled into the porch chair and watched him work. There was something satisfying about it. The clean, purposeful sound of a hammer in the morning. The sight of a man doing a straightforward thing well. Mitchell had always been like that. Competent, focused. When he committed to a task, he gave it his full attention, and watching him now, I felt the particular pride a father carries quietly, the kind you never quite find the right words for. But watching, I noticed something. Every few minutes, not constantly, not obviously, but with a regularity I'd only catch if I wasn't looking for it, Mitchell's eyes would drift. Not to the yard, not to the work in front of him, to the kitchen window, to the wall inside where I kept the calendar, the one with my handwritten notes about appointments and reminders that Dorothea had bought me the habit of keeping. He'd glance just for a second, then return to the fence post like nothing had happened. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Some part of me registered it and set it aside the way you set aside small things that don't have a shape yet. That was my first mistake of the morning. The second came about an hour later. Mitchell was working on the post closest to the property line, the one that sat maybe 18 inches from the edge of Herbert Caulfield's yard. He'd loosened it more than he intended, trying to reset the base, and when the wood shifted, it went fast. The post kicked out at an angle, catching the fence rail on its way down, and the whole section swung hard to the left before either of us could move. The sound it made hitting Herbert's peony bush was not a sound I'll forget easily. A sharp, dense crack, the kind that means something gave way that wasn't designed to. I was on my feet before the echo cleared. Herbert Caulfield was 79 years old, lean as a fence post himself, with white hair cropped close and hands that had the permanent roughness of someone who'd worked outdoors his entire life. He wasn't a man who raised his voice often. I'd learned that in the years we'd been neighbors, but when he came out that back door, he didn't need to raise it. There was a fury in his stillness that was louder than shouting. He crossed his yard in a straight line, eyes fixed on the damaged jaw set. "Mark that plant," he said, and then stopped. Like the words ran out before the feeling did. Mitchell was already apologizing, hands up, voice calm, all the right words in the right order. He was good at that, Mitchell was. But Herbert wasn't listening. He was crouched down beside the broken canes, his large, rough hands moving over the damage with a gentleness that seemed like it belonged to a different man entirely. I came off the porch and crossed the yard. "Herbert." I kept my voice even. "It was an accident. I'll make it right, whatever it needs, I'll cover it. A replacement, a specialist, whatever you want." He looked up at me then, and I expected the anger to land square on my face. It didn't. What I saw in his eyes just for that moment before he shut it away, behind something harder, it wasn't anger. It was the raw, unguarded expression of a man who just watched something irreplaceable get broken. The kind of look that belongs to grief, not to inconvenience. It was there and gone in a second, replaced by the wall he usually kept between himself and the neighborhood. He stood up. He didn't say anything else. He walked back across his yard, went inside, and pulled the door closed behind him. I stood there at the fence line for a long moment. Later that afternoon, Connie Hartfield stopped by. She'd seen the commotion from her front window, she said, and wanted to make sure everything was all right. I told her what happened, and she shook her head slowly in that way she had when something genuinely troubled her. "That bush," she said. "I've lived on this street for 11 years. Warren and Herbert has never let anyone near that thing. Not the garden club ladies, not the landscaping crew. When the HOA hired one that one summer, nobody." She paused, looking toward his house. "I don't know the story behind it, but whatever it is, it matters to him more than just about anything else on that property." I thought about that look on his face, that moment before the wall went back up. I was still thinking about it when I went to bed that night. I don't know what time it was when I woke. Late the street was the particular dark and quiet that only happens after midnight in a residential neighborhood, when even the dogs have stopped, and the only sound is wind working through the bare branches of the oak tree out front. I'd woken for no reason I could name, the way you sometimes do when something at the edge of awareness pulls you up before you know what it is. I lay still for a moment. Then I turned toward the window. Mitchell was standing in the backyard. He was near the fence line, close to where the damage had happened, phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't moving at all. He stood in that still, deliberate way he had, and his voice was too low to make out just the shape of it, controlled and careful, the way a man speaks when he wants to be sure no one hears. I was about to let the curtain fall and go back to sleep when the wind shifted, carrying one word up to the window with a clarity that made me go still. Soon, I lay back down. I stared at the ceiling in the dark. Work call, I told myself. Time zones. A deal he's been working on. Mitchell was a capable, driven young man with a full life I didn't always understand the details of. Late phone calls were nothing unusual for someone in his position. I pulled the blanket up and closed my eyes. I told myself it was work. I was wrong. The hammer wasn't in the garage where I'd left it. I retraced my steps, back porch, side yard, the spot along the fence where Mitchell had been working Saturday morning. Nothing. I figured he'd brought it inside at some point and thought no more of it. The house was still quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists before 7 in the morning, when even the street outside seems to be holding its breath. Mitchell's door was open a crack. I pushed it gently, just enough to step inside. He was still asleep, lying on his back, one arm across his chest, the slow, measured breathing of a man without anything pressing on him. I moved quietly, scanning the room for the toolbox, or at least the hammer on its own. That was when I noticed the room itself. Mitchell had always been tidy, but this was something different. The surfaces were clear, not in the way of someone who unpacks and settles in, but in the way of someone who's kept everything ready to move. The duffel bag was zipped closed and pushed against the wall at a precise angle. Nothing personal sat out. No book left open, no jacket thrown over the chair. The room had the careful blankness of a space someone was passing through, not inhabiting. I told myself he'd always been like this. Organized, efficient. The toolbox was on the floor beside the dresser. I crouched to pull it out, and as I did, my hand caught the edge of the bottom drawer, not fully closed, jutting out just enough that I hadn't seen it from the doorway. It slid open another inch with the contact. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I was looking for a hammer in a toolbox, and I happened to glance down. The paper was folded into quarters, sitting on top of what looked like a road atlas and a spare phone charger. Plain white paper, nothing distinctive about it. I might have ignored it entirely if it hadn't been unfolded slightly at one corner enough to see the handwriting inside Mitchell's handwriting that cramped. Left-leaning print I'd watched him develop in middle school. I picked it up. I don't know why exactly. Some instinct, some pull I couldn't name. I opened it. The page was divided into time slots written in 2 columns. The left column listed hours. The right column listed what I did during those hours. 6 o'clock coffee front porch, 20 to 25 minutes. 7 o'clock medication kitchen alone. 8 o'clock walk. Oak Street loop, 35 to 40 minutes. 9 o'clock garden or back porch, 45 minutes. 12 o'clock lunch, kitchen table alone. 2 o'clock rest or reading living room. 5:30 dinner prep kitchen. 9:30 bed. Every hour, every habit. Laid out in his handwriting with the clean precision of a man who had been watching and recording. My first feeling, and I want to be honest about this, because it matters, was not suspicion. It was something closer to being moved. Mitchell had always worried about me living alone. After his mother passed, he'd offered more than once to come stay, to help me find a care arrangement, to look into options. I'd always turned him down. I was 58, not 88, and I was perfectly capable of managing my own mornings. But standing there in the quiet of his room looking at this page, I thought he's been keeping track. Making sure someone knows my routine, in case something happens. I refolded it along the original creases and placed it back exactly as I'd found it. I took the hammer and left. Amber was in the kitchen when I came down the hall. She was standing at the counter with her back to me. And she didn't hear me come. The floors in this house have always been quieter than they look. When I set the toolbox down on the table, she turned. The reaction was small. So small that a less attentive man might have missed it entirely. A slight drawing back, a fraction of a second, before the smile arrived, as if her face had to make a quick decision, about what expression to wear, and the smile won, but only just. "Morning," she said. "I was about to make tea. Don't go to any trouble," I told her. "It's no trouble." She was already turning back to the counter hands, moving with that easy efficiency I'd admired before. "You look tired, Warren." I told her I'd slept fine. Connie Hartfield came by mid-morning while Mitchell had taken the car to pick up a few things in town. She stayed on the porch, wouldn't come in, said she only had a minute. We talked about the neighborhood, about the Hendersons down the block, who were putting their house on the market, about the cold that still hadn't fully let go. Then she said, almost as an aside, "I've been thinking about what I mentioned before about Mitchell asking around about services for you." She paused, choosing her words. "He was thorough about it, Warren. He didn't just ask about who handles the paperwork. He asked about timelines, specifically about life insurance, how long the process takes from the time a claim is filed to the time funds are actually released." She looked at me. "I thought it was a little specific is all, but maybe that's just how he thinks." "That sounds like him," I said. After she left, I sat on the porch for a while. The cold pressed in through my jacket, but I didn't go inside. Thorough, I thought. That's Mitchell. He doesn't do anything halfway. That evening, over the dinner, Amber had made something with pasta, warm and filling. Mitchell talked easily about work, about a project in Des Moines he'd been consulting on. Amber laughed at the right moments. The kitchen was warm with the smell of food and the comfortable noise of a family eating together. Then I stood up to carry my plate to the sink, and the room tilted. It wasn't dramatic. Just a sudden softness at the edges of my vision, a brief vertigo that made me put one hand on the back of my chair and wait it out. 2-3 seconds, and it passed. "Dad." Mitchell was already on his feet, one hand at my elbow. "You all right?" "Fine," I said. "Stood up too fast. It happens." Amber was watching from her side of the table, hands still, eyes on my face. "You should sit back down," she said. Her voice was warm and concerned. It was exactly the right thing to say, in exactly the right tone. I sat back down. Later upstairs, I lay in the dark and let the day move through my mind, the way days do before sleep. Not in order, but in pieces. The folded paper. The time slots in Mitchell's handwriting. Connie's pause before the words specifically. The slight tilt of the room when I stood. And Amber's face, that fraction of a second this morning, before the smile. I turned onto my side and looked at the window. "You're reading into things," I told myself. "You're a man who lives alone and thinks too much, and your son is downstairs caring about whether you're safe, which is more than most men your age can say." I closed my eyes. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe. Mitchell and Amber had left after dinner, and the house had gone back to being what it always was, mine alone. I'd done the dishes, checked the locks, turned off the lights in the rooms I wouldn't use. By 9:30, I was in the armchair in the living room, with the floor lamp on, and a novel open across my knee, doing that thing where you read the same paragraph 3 times, and none of it sticks. My mind kept circling back to what Connie had said on the porch. Timelines. How long from filing to funds released? I kept finding reasonable explanations for it, lining them up, and then watching them fall over. The knock came at 10 o'clock. Not tentative, not apologetic. 3 solid raps against the front door, evenly spaced, the kind of knock that belongs to someone who made a decision and followed through on it. I set the book down and sat there for a moment, just listening. Then I got up. Herbert Caulfield was standing on my front porch, in a brown canvas coat collar, turned up against the March cold. His wool cap held in both hands in front of him, rather than on his head, the way men of a certain generation hold their hats when they've come to say something that matters. His white hair was combed. He looked like a man who had thought about this visit for longer than one evening. "I'm not here about the rose bush," he said. I stepped back from the door. "Come in, Herbert." He wiped his boots on the mat with the same precision he applied to everything twice on each side, and followed me into the kitchen. I put the kettle on. He sat at the table without being asked, setting his cap on the edge near him and folding his hands on the surface. He looked at the room with the eyes of someone recalibrating, adjusting an internal image to match what was actually there. I put 2 cups down and sat across from him. We stayed like that for a moment. Not uncomfortable exactly, but honest 2 men who had been neighbors for years, without ever really talking, sitting close enough, now that neither of us could pretend the distance was normal. "How long did you know her?" I asked. It seemed like the right place to start. He looked at me steadily. 22 years, give or take. 22 years. Dorothea and I had been married for 26. I had known her my entire adult life and believed the way you believe things that have never been tested, that I knew her fully. 22 years was not a small number. "The Garden Club," Herbert said. "Cedar Falls Horticultural Society." She came to the first meeting I ever attended and told me I was pruning my roses wrong, bluntly, without being asked. The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the memory of one. I respected that immediately. He told me about it in the measured way he did everything, no embellishment, no performance. They'd met every 3rd Thursday. Dorothea had taught him to propagate the peony from a cutting she'd brought from her own garden, spent 2 full seasons coaching him through the process. They'd talk the way people talk when they share a task they both care about. He knew things about her. I'd never heard her opinions on neighbors I recognized, but never thought she'd noticed. The frustration she carried about a project at the library board she'd never mentioned at home, the way she laughed at jokes. She pretended not to find funny. I sat there and listened, and the strange feeling that moved through me was not jealousy and not grief exactly. It was something more like wonder, that she had contained all of this, and I'd only ever known my portion of it. That even after 26 years, Dorothea had rooms I'd never stood in. "She called me," Herbert said, "about 4 months before she passed. He said it plainly, no easing into it. He was that kind of man. She was worried about Mitchell." He kept his eyes on his cup. She said she'd been watching him for a while. Not watching the way a mother watches a child, but watching the way you watch something you're not sure about anymore. She said there was something different in how he looked at things. At you. At the house. She couldn't name it exactly, but she'd seen enough in her life to know the difference between a man who's struggling and a man who's calculating. The word landed in the kitchen and stayed there. "She didn't tell me," I said. "No." Herbert looked up. "She knew you." She said, and I'm telling you her words because she chose them carefully. She said he'll defend Mitchell. He won't see it until it's laid out in front of him, because that's the kind of father he is, and I love him for it, but someone needs to be watching from the outside. He paused. She asked me to be that someone. I didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree, and the old house settled around us in that way old houses do, creaking faintly like it was listening too. "You agreed," I said finally. I gave her my word. He said it without drama. To Herbert, that appeared to be the full explanation. We sat a while longer, talking about less about the neighborhood, about the spring coming in slow this year. The kind of conversation that fills the space after something important has been said, and neither person is ready to leave yet. By 10:45, I could see the tiredness on him, the particular heaviness of a man past 70 who has held something difficult for a long time and finally set it down. He stood and picked up his cap. "I'll come back tomorrow morning," he said. "There's something I need to show you, something I've been keeping." He said it the way you'd say the weather was changing, factual, certain, not inviting questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. I walked him to the door and watched him cross the yard in the dark, back straight steps, careful on the cold ground. Then I went back to the kitchen. I sat at the table with the coffee that had gone cold while we talked, and I didn't move for a long time. The house was fully quiet now. Not the comfortable quiet of a man who lives alone by choice, but the kind that presses in, that makes you aware of all the space between yourself and everything else. I turned the cup in my hands. "What did you see, Dottie?" I thought. Not out loud, just the words forming somewhere behind my sternum, the way thoughts do when you're asking someone who isn't there anymore. "What did you know about our son that you couldn't bring yourself to tell me?" The floor lamp in the living room threw a long rectangle of light down the hallway. The rest of the house was dark. I sat there until well past midnight, and the coffee never got warm again. He came at 8 o'clock, same as he'd said. I heard the knock before I finished pouring my first cup, 3 even raps, the same as the night before, like Herbert Caulfield had one way of announcing himself and saw no reason to vary it. When I opened the door, he was already stepping inside, moving past me toward the kitchen with the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided where he was going. He pulled out the same chair he'd used the night before and sat down without being asked. I set a cup in front of him and took my seat across the table. Outside, the April light was doing what it does in Iowa in early spring. Tentative pale, not yet convinced it was allowed to stay. The yard was quiet. Through the window above the sink, I could see the back of the house next door. Herbert's side of the fence, the broken peony canes still visible from where I sat. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between us. He didn't slide it toward me. He just put it there and left it the way you leave something for a person to pick up when they're ready. "The evening Mitchell worked on your fence," he said. "I was in the back garden. Later than usual, I water after sundown when the ground holds it better." He looked at the paper, not at me. He didn't see me. I was near the far end behind the arbor. When the post came down and he and I had our exchange, he climbed back to your side. Something fell out of his jacket pocket as he went over. He didn't notice. He nodded toward the folded paper. I picked it up. The outside told me nothing. Plain white, folded into quarters, edges slightly worn, like it had been handled more than once. I opened it on the kitchen table and smoothed the creases flat. The top of the page held 2 names. The first was a company name I recognized, the insurance firm that had handled the policy Dorothea and I had taken out years ago, updated twice since then. The second name was written below it, underlined once, with the deliberate stroke of someone marking a reference point: Dominic Reardon. I didn't know that name. I looked up at Herbert. "The man on the phone," he said. "I heard Mitchell use it. Twice." He told me what he'd heard, keeping it short, and without editorializing the way a man gives testimony when he wants to be believed. Mitchell's voice low and controlled, the kind of controlled that takes effort. A conversation that had clearly been going for some time before Herbert caught the end of it. Fragments, but clear ones. The insurance arrangement, the old man's health is going the way we expected. 3 more weeks should be enough. A name, Dominic repeated, like an anchor, like the name of a man Mitchell was being careful to reassure. I looked back at the paper. Below the 2 names in red ink that stood out from the black ballpoint of everything else on the page, $340,000. No label, no explanation. Just the number written with the bluntness of a figure someone had been staring at long enough to stop needing context for it. Below that D, 3 weeks. I touched the paper with my fingertip just below that line. "What is D?" I asked. Herbert looked at me across the table. He didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't have one, I thought, but because he was deciding how much he was certain of and how much was still inference. He was not a man who spoke past the edge of what he knew. He said, "I'm not sure yet." I turned the paper over. On the back, written in a different pen, blue slightly smeared at one edge, as if it had been copied quickly, was an address in Des Moines. A suite number and what I recognized from the street name as the business district near the Capitol. Below the address in smaller print, Hartley and Column Associates Life Settlement and Indemnity. A law firm, the kind that specialized in the financial architecture of insurance claims. I set the paper down and didn't say anything for a while. The refrigerator hummed. The morning light shifted through the window, and through the glass above the sink, I saw Amber. She was standing at the kitchen counter, my kitchen counter, the one visible through the side window that looked into the addition I'd built 12 years ago. She had her back to me, doing the breakfast dishes, moving through the task, with the same ease she brought to everything. But what struck me standing there holding that piece of paper was the sound. She was humming, then singing softly under her breath. Something I half recognized, a melody without urgency, the kind a person carries when their mind is elsewhere, and the elsewhere is comfortable. She didn't look worried. She didn't look like someone waiting for news. She moved through my kitchen with the unhurried peace of a person whose plans were proceeding exactly as expected. I thought about the morning I'd found the drawer open, the way her face had arranged itself so quickly when she heard me come in, the precise half-second before the smile. I didn't say any of this to Herbert. I wasn't ready to say it out loud. Saying it out loud would mean something I wasn't prepared to mean yet. He finished his coffee and stood returning the cup to the edge of the table the way he did, considerate, unobtrusive. "I'll leave that with you," he said, nodding at the paper. "Do with it what you think is right." He paused at the kitchen doorway. "But don't wait too long. In 3 weeks means something, Warren, and time has a way of not waiting for us to be ready." He let himself out the front door, and I heard it close with that same quiet finality. I stood in the kitchen alone. Through the window, Amber had moved to the stove, now tilting a pan, her back still turned. The melody continued low, unhurried, utterly at ease. I looked at the paper on the table, at the red number, at the name Dominic Reardon, at the address of a law firm that handled the kind of business a son should never have reason to look into on his father's behalf. And I stood there in my own kitchen, in the early April light of a house that had once been full and was now full again, in a way that no longer felt like comfort, and I began to think, really think. For the first time since March, I began to let myself think. If you're still here, comment 5 so I know you're still with me. And tell me this. If you were in my place right now, would you confront him immediately? Or stay quiet and wait to see how far this goes? I want to know what you would do. And just a quick note before we continue. Parts of what you're about to hear include some fictional elements added for storytelling and reflection. If this kind of story isn't for you, this might be a good place to stop. I didn't move from the kitchen for a long time after Herbert left. The house was quiet in the way it gets when something has shifted and the rooms haven't caught up yet. Same walls, same light coming through the same windows. The coffee mug from breakfast still on the counter. The dish towel Amber had folded and hung over the oven handle edges, perfectly aligned. I turned and looked at the shelf above the stove. The tin was right where it had always been, pushed toward the back, behind the regular coffee and the box of oatmeal, the way you'd tuck something you planned to reach for every day. Amber had placed it there that first evening, and it had stayed unremarked the way objects do when they become routine. I had drunk from it every night they were here and several evenings since, when she'd left me a portion already measured out in a small cloth pouch, with a handwritten note that said just steep for 8 minutes, good for circulation. I reached up and took it down. The tin was a plain, matte green. No brand I recognized, with a handwritten label on the bottom in Amber's careful script. I opened the lid. The contents smelled faintly sweet and herbal, the way teas like this do, inoffensive, pleasant. The smell of something that was meant to reassure you. On the inside of the lid was a small card with the listed ingredients. I read them slowly, more slowly than I usually read anything. Most of them I recognized. Chamomile, lemon balm, passion flower, the standard vocabulary of something sold as a sleep aid. But near the bottom, 2 names I had to read twice. Convallaria majalis extract and Digitalis lanata blend. I didn't know what those were. I took out my phone and looked them up. I stood in my kitchen for 5 minutes and read, and the longer I read, the stiller I became. Both compounds were plant-derived. Both belonged to a family known in very deliberate and regulated doses for cardiovascular applications. Both in unregulated accumulation, taken over weeks in small amounts, that would register as nothing unusual in a single day, could produce exactly what I had been experiencing. The heaviness, the dizziness when I stood, the sleep that swallowed me whole without leaving me rested, and both continued long enough, could cause cardiac failure that presented to anyone not specifically looking for it as entirely natural. The kind of decline a doctor might attribute to age, the kind a coroner might not question, in a 58-year-old man with no prior history of anything suspicious. I set the tin on the counter. I picked up my phone. I scrolled to a name I hadn't called since Winter Drive, Carol Finch, who had been Dorothea's physician through the last 2 years of her illness, and had sat with me in that waiting room at Covenant Medical more times than either of us would have chosen. She was 52 precise in the way good doctors are precise, and she had always been honest with me even when honest was hard. She picked up on the third ring. I kept my voice level. I told her I needed to ask her something clinical off the record for the moment. I read her the 2 compound names from the tin. Then I described methodically the way I'd learned from years of writing inspection reports, the pattern of symptoms over the past 3 weeks. The sleep, the vertigo, the fatigue that had no clear source. The pause on her end lasted longer than I expected. She's Warren. Her voice when it came back was careful in a way that told me everything before she said the rest. I need you to come in tomorrow morning. First appointment before anyone else. Don't mention this call to anyone in your household. And in the meantime, don't accept food or drink prepared by anyone other than yourself. A brief pause. Can you do that? Yes, I said. There are reporting requirements I'm obligated to follow, if what I'm thinking is confirmed, she said. But I'm going to give you 48 hours from the time of your results to take whatever steps you need to take first. That's the most I can do within the bounds of what's right. After that, this moves out of my hands. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I stood in the kitchen, took a slow breath, and thought about what I was actually doing. I was a 58-year-old man who had just stood in his own home and looked up the toxicology of his daughter-in-law's herbal tea. A man who had spent the last 3 weeks sleeping like a man 20 years older, blaming the weather and his age and the ordinary sadness of living alone. I picked up the tin, slid it into a plastic bag from the drawer beneath the sink, and carried it out to the garage. Behind the lower shelf of the tool cabinet, in the space where I kept the extra caulking and the box of mismatched screws, I pushed it to the back wall where nothing would disturb it. Then I went inside and made dinner myself. The following morning, I arrived at Covenant Medical Center before the parking lot had filled. The building sat on the east side of Cedar Falls, a low, wide structure in red brick that had been there long enough to feel like a permanent part of the landscape. I'd been here more times than I cared to count, first with Dorothea, then for my own routine appointments, the ordinary maintenance of a body getting older. Dr. Finch met me in a side examination room, no receptionist involved. She was already in her coat, a stethoscope around her neck, her dark hair pulled back the way she always wore it on working days. She looked at me with the careful attention of someone who had already formed a hypothesis and was hoping to be wrong. She drew blood herself, labeled the vials by hand, and told me the full panel would take 72 hours through the specialized lab she was sending it to. Try to behave normally, she said. Don't change your routine in any obvious way. I drove home. 3 days later, she called me before 8 in the morning. I sat at the kitchen table and listened. She was precise and unhurried, the way she'd always been, the quality I'd trusted most about her through the hardest year of my life. Cardiac glycoside accumulation confirmed. The concentration wasn't acute. This had been building, gradually introduced in small, regular doses over an extended period. The effect on the heart was cumulative. Left uninterrupted, the trajectory would eventually produce an event consistent with natural cardiac failure. There was a silence after she finished. "Who prepares your food and drink on a regular basis, Warren?" she asked. I looked at the table, at the space where the tin used to sit on the shelf behind me. I didn't answer right away. We both already knew. I drove home in silence. Not the radio, not the news, nothing. Just the road and the April sun hitting the windshield at a low angle, the kind of light that makes you squint even when it isn't warm. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat there, both hands on the wheel, the house in front of me. My house, the one Dorothea and I had chosen together, the one where Mitchell had grown up and learned to ride a bike in this very driveway, the one where I had believed, until 3 weeks ago, that the hardest thing I had left to face was being alone. The April light was steady and indifferent. I had 48 hours. Those 3 days were the longest I have ever spent inside my own life. I made breakfast at the usual time. I sat at the table with Mitchell and exchanged the ordinary words men exchange over eggs and coffee work whether the gutters needed attention before the spring rains came in heavy. I asked Amber about her sister, who'd apparently been dealing with a move. I listened to the answers. I nodded in the right places. I kept my hands from doing anything my face wasn't doing. Every morning Amber made tea. She brought it to me with the same warmth she always had, both hands around the mug. That easy smile, the small ritual of care she'd built into the rhythm of the house. I accepted it the same way I always had. I said thank you. I waited until she turned back to the counter or moved toward the other room, and then I poured it down the drain and rinsed the mug and set it back on the table before she could see. I did this 3 mornings in a row, and each time I sat across from her at breakfast and looked at her face, that open, pleasant face, and felt something I didn't have a clean word for. Not anger yet. Something older and heavier than anger. Something that felt like standing on ground you'd trusted your whole life and hearing it shift beneath your feet. The call from Dr. Finch came on the 3rd afternoon. She gave it to me straight the way she always had, because she knew I didn't need it softened. Cardiac glycoside accumulation, confirmed the concentration consistent with gradual intentional introduction over a period of several weeks. Not enough to cause an acute event, not yet. But the trajectory was clear. Given enough time and continued exposure, the cumulative effect on the heart would produce what any standard examination would record as natural cardiac failure. She said the word intentional once, and neither of us returned to it. I thanked her. I put the phone down on the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment. Then I got up and went to the study. Mitchell and Amber had taken the car out after lunch. Amber had mentioned a grocery run, maybe an hour. I had been waiting for this window without letting myself appear to be waiting for it. I closed the study door behind me and went to the floor, safe behind the filing cabinet. The one Dorothea and I had installed when we first moved in, because she believed in keeping originals of everything in a place you controlled. I entered the combination and opened it. Inside, the deed to the house, our wills, the paid-off title on the car, and the insurance policy. I pulled the policy out and carried it to the desk. I had a copy in my email, the version I'd scanned and saved years ago as a backup. I pulled that up on my computer and set the two side by side. Original on the left, physical document on the right. The differences were not large. They were not meant to be seen by someone who wasn't looking. The signature on the policy update form, the one dated 14 months ago, which I had no memory of signing, was close enough to mine that I had to look twice to find where it broke from the pattern. The loop on the W in my last name. The angle of the terminal stroke on the D. Subtle. The work of someone who had practiced or had help from someone who had. The coverage amount, I knew what it had been. $300,000. The figure Dorothea and I had agreed on when we updated the policy, after she passed enough to clear the house and leave something behind without being excessive. The document in front of me read $1.2 million. The beneficiary address had been changed as well. Not the name still mine, still the estate, but the disbursement routing the address where funds would be directed pending probate. I didn't recognize it. I wrote it down on a notepad, folded it, put it in my shirt pocket. Then I sat down on the floor with my back against the safe, because my legs had decided that was where we were going. The clock on the bookshelf ticked. Dorothea had found it at an estate sale the first month we lived in this house. a small brass mantel clock, with a sound she described as sensible, meaning it didn't hurry. I had listened to that clock every night for 26 years without ever really hearing it. I heard it now. Tick, tick, tick. I sat on the floor of my own study holding forged insurance documents in my hands, and I listened to my dead wife's clock keep time. And I let myself feel for exactly as long as I could afford to feel it, the full weight of what was happening in my house. Then I got up. I called Herbert. He arrived in 15 minutes. Same coat as always. Same unhurried pace up the front walk. I laid it out for him at the kitchen table, the results, the documents, the numbers, the changed address. I kept my voice level. I had practiced it on the drive from the study to the kitchen. Herbert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than waiting. "There's a man," he said. "Frank Westcott, retired from Cedar Falls PD 3 years ago after 30 years on the force. He has a private investigator's license through the state of Iowa now." He looked at me evenly. "And he has a reason to care about this beyond the professional." I asked what he meant. "His mother, Ruth, she was unwell for the last few years before she passed. Couldn't drive, couldn't manage on her own, didn't have much family nearby." He paused. "Dorothea visited her twice a week for almost 2 years. Groceries company someone to call the doctor when things got worse. Frank knows what that meant to his mother." Herbert's hands rested flat on the table. "I've already spoken to him. He's willing to meet." We went to Herbert's house. Frank Westcott was already there when we arrived, seated at Herbert's kitchen table with a coffee mug and a yellow legal pad. The kind of man who fills a room not by being loud, but by being thoroughly present. He was 58, same age as me, with close-cut gray hair, and the particular quality of stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms where everything matters. His eyes moved over me once when I came through the door, the quick cataloging look of someone who reads people for information rather than impression. I sat across from him and told him everything. From the first night of heavy sleep, to the forged signature, to the address in Des Moines. I spoke for almost 20 minutes without stopping, and he listened without interrupting, once making occasional marks on the legal pad, with a pen that moved in short, precise strokes. When I finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. "The disbursement address," he said. "I'll run it tonight." He turned a page. "And I'll need Mitchell's regular movements. Where he goes, who he meets, how much contact he's maintaining with this Dominic Reardon." He looked up. "Give me 10 days, he said. "I'll have enough to act on by then." I nodded. I walked home alone in the early April evening, back across the yard, through my front door, into the house where dinner needed to be started, and where 2 people I had trusted completely were somewhere inside going about the business of an ordinary evening. 10 days. I turned on the kitchen light and began making dinner, and the clock in the study ticked on, steady and unhurried, just the way Dorothea always liked it. 10 days passed. The way days pass when you're waiting for something. You're not sure you want to know slowly enough that you feel each one, quickly enough that the end arrives before you've made your peace with it. I had kept the routine. Coffee at 6, the walk at 8, dinner made by my own hands every evening. Mitchell and Amber had come and gone twice during those 10 days, once for 2 nights midweek, once for a single evening that stretched later than usual. Each time Amber brought the tea. Each time I accepted it and disposed of it when she wasn't watching. Each time Mitchell sat across from me and asked how I was feeling, and I told him fine, a little tired, probably the change in weather. Each time I looked at him and thought about the signature on the insurance documents. I didn't let myself feel it. Not yet. On the 11th morning, Herbert called and told me Westcott was ready. Herbert's kitchen was the same as always, spotless, spare, the particular order of a man who had lived alone long enough to impose his own logic on every surface. Westcott was already seated when I arrived, a manila folder and a short stack of photographs on the table in front of him, a coffee mug he hadn't touched. He didn't open with pleasantries. Mitchell Pendleton has been running more than one operation simultaneously, he said, and placed the first photograph on the table. It showed Mitchell at a corner table in what looked like a coffee shop I didn't recognize downtown, somewhere not Cedar Falls. He was leaning forward, both forearms on the table, talking to a man whose face was caught in partial profile. He looked relaxed, comfortable, the way a man looks when a meeting is going the direction he planned. The man across from him is Gary Renfield, Westcott said. He ran a property investment firm out of Ames. You two had a dispute. I believe it involved a contracted survey and some significant money about 6 years ago. I knew the name. I knew the dispute. It had ended badly, expensively, and with the kind of mutual bitterness that doesn't fully dissolve. Mitchell has been in contact with him for at least 4 months, Westcott continued. He's been providing Renfield with detailed records, financial records. Your accounts, your assets, outstanding, invoices, the property valuation Dorothea left in trust. He looked at me steadily. Renfield has been using that information to build a legal case against you. A civil action, the kind that takes everything you have in fees before it ever reaches a judgment. I looked at the photograph, Mitchell leaning forward, smiling, relaxed as a man on vacation. He's running 2 separate tracks, Westcott said. The insurance arrangement with Dominic Reardon covers the direct approach. Renfield covers the financial dismantlement in the event the first track hits a complication. If one fails, the other strips you down anyway. I absorbed that. It took a moment. Westcott placed a second photograph. This one was taken through what appeared to be a coffee shop window, exterior shot, long lens, a table near the glass. Mitchell on the left and on the right, a man I hadn't seen before, and recognized immediately from the way he occupied space. Broad shoulders, a face that held no expression. The camera could catch a stillness that had nothing peaceful in it. He was dressed simply, dark jacket, no tie, and he was listening to Amber. Because Amber was talking, that was what stopped me. In every image I'd constructed of this situation over the past weeks, and I had constructed many lying awake in the dark, I had allowed myself somewhere at the back of my thinking to hold on to a version of Amber that was smaller than the truth. A woman who had been drawn into something she didn't fully understand. A woman under pressure. A woman who might, if given the chance, make a different choice. The photograph didn't leave room for that version. She was leaning forward, one hand extended, with a finger raised, making a point, emphasizing something to Dominic Reardon, with the focused energy of someone running a negotiation, not following one. Her expression was clear and direct. She wasn't afraid of the man across from her. She wasn't deferring to Mitchell. She was engaged, invested, and entirely at ease. Dominic Reardon. Westcott confirmed, though I hadn't asked. I looked at the photograph for a long time. The pregnancy, I said. Westcott reached into the folder and produced a single printed page, a record summary, names and dates redacted from the header, but the institutional formatting recognizable. I ran a check through a contact at Cedar Valley and the 2 nearest regional facilities, he said. No prenatal intake, no obstetric appointments, no records of any kind under her name within a 50-mile radius. I checked back 14 weeks. He set the page beside the photograph. There's no pregnancy, he said. There never was. I sat with that. The pregnancy had been the last thing I'd held on to, without examining the one piece of the picture I had kept behind glass, untouched. Amber telling me at dinner, her voice soft and careful, the way Mitchell had watched my face as she said it. I had felt something shift in my chest when she told me, something that felt like the future arriving. A grandchild. The house full again eventually, the way houses are supposed to be full. I had let myself want that. I looked at the woman in the photograph, The woman who had made tea in my kitchen every morning for weeks, who had folded dish towels and hummed under her breath and told me to sit down and rest. And I felt something move through me that I had no name for in the moment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was colder than either of those things. It was the feeling of a room you thought you knew becoming all at once completely strange. Herbert had not spoken since I arrived. He sat at the end of the table with his hands folded the way he sat when he was being a witness rather than a participant. Westcott stacked the photographs back into the folder with the same economy of motion he brought to everything. "We have enough to act," he said. "The question is how you want to approach it." I looked at the folder on the table. "Give me one night," I said. "I need one night." He nodded once, no argument the way a man nods when he's already anticipated the answer. I drove home in the early evening light, the April sky going pink and gold over the flat fields at the edge of town. I pulled into the driveway. I sat for a moment, looking at the house. Then I went inside and made dinner for one, and ate it alone at the kitchen table and washed the dishes by hand and turned off the lights one by one. I lay down in the dark and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, for the first time since March, when all of this was still just a feeling I didn't know what to do with, I didn't think about Dorothea. I didn't hear her voice, didn't reach for the comfort of her memory, the way I usually did in the hard hours of the night. I thought about the morning. I thought about what I was going to say, and to whom, and in what order. I thought about the steps. And somewhere before midnight, without noticing the exact moment it happened, I fell asleep. I called Westcott at 6:15 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been awake for a while already. I didn't say much. I said, "Do it." He said he'd be at Herbert's in an hour. I dressed, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and looked at the backyard in the early morning light, the fence still unrepaired on one section, the peony canes next door beginning to show the first tentative signs of recovery. The April air through the gap in the window frame smelled like wet soil and something faintly green underneath it, the way Iowa smells when the ground finally admits that winter is finished. I drank the coffee and waited. Herbert's kitchen had become, over the past weeks, something close to a war room, not by design, but by accumulation. Westcott's legal pads, Herbert's quiet presence at the end of the table, the particular gravity that settles into a room where serious things have been decided. When I arrived, Westcott had already laid out a single sheet of paper with the day's sequence written in his short, direct handwriting. He walked me through it without ceremony. Mitchell had a standing Thursday meeting with a contractor he'd been consulting for a regular appointment at an office building on Collins Road. Predictable enough that Westcott had confirmed it twice over the past 10 days, at 9 in the morning. While Mitchell was in that meeting, two members of Westcott's network, both retired law enforcement, both licensed, would intercept him there. Not aggressively, professionally. They would present what had been gathered and make clear that cooperation was in his interest. At the same time, and Westcott was precise about the simultaneity, because it mattered he and I would be at my house where Amber would still be unaware that anything was in motion. "The timing has to hold," Westcott said. "If either of them makes contact with the other before we're in position, we lose the element that makes this manageable." He looked at me. "She won't be expecting it," he said. "That's not a comfortable thing to walk into. You should be prepared for that." I told him I understood. He folded the sheet once and slid it into his jacket pocket. "I'll be at your door at 7 tomorrow morning." He looked at Herbert, then back at me. "Get some rest tonight." I almost said something to that. Instead, I nodded and went home. I didn't go to bed early. I sat in the study for a long time. The room had always been more mine than any other in the house bookshelves I'd built myself, the desk I'd had since before we moved in, the floor lamp Dorothea had bought, because she said the overhead light made the room look like an interrogation. The safe was still in its place behind the filing cabinet. The insurance documents were back inside it, originals, and the forged version separated by a plain manila envelope. On the desk was the photograph. I'd taken it out earlier without fully deciding to a framed picture from the year Mitchell turned 10, the summer we'd driven down to the Ozarks for a week, and someone at the campground had offered to take a family photo. Dorothea and I were standing on either side of him, and Mitchell was between us with both arms stretched wide, one hand gripping each of ours, grinning with the particular abandon of a child who has no reason yet to hold anything back. He had been a good boy. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me to be accurate. He had been kind to animals, patient with his grandmother in her last years, the kind of student teachers remembered. He'd cried in my arms the morning after Dorothea left us, real grief, the kind that has no shape, that just moves through a person and leaves them emptied out. I had held him and felt his shoulders shake and thought, at least we have each other. I looked at the boy in the photograph. I tried to trace a line from that child to the man in Westcott's photographs, leaning forward across a table, relaxed and deliberate, selling what was mine to people who wanted to see me reduced to nothing. I tried to find the moment where the path bent the place I could point to and say, that's where it happened. I couldn't find it. That was the thing that stayed with me longest in that quiet room with the floor lamp on and the rest of the house dark. Not the anger I'd expected, the anger, and it was there, but it was quieter than I'd anticipated, weighted down by something heavier. What I couldn't move past was the question I kept returning to: had there been signs I'd ignored, or had there simply been nothing to see? Some people break loudly in ways you can trace a bad year, a wrong turn, you can name a wound that explains the scar. And some things fracture from the inside in ways that leave no mark on the surface until the structure finally gives. I didn't know which Mitchell was. I wasn't sure it would ever be something I fully understood. What I did know was that the question didn't change what had to happen tomorrow. I sat with the photograph for another 20 minutes. I thought about the camping trip, about the drive home with Mitchell asleep in the back seat, and Dorothea reading in the passenger seat, and the summer dark going past the windows. I thought about how complete that had felt, how solid. Then I set the photograph face down on the desk. Not because I wanted to stop seeing it, because I needed both hands free for what came next, and grief, I had learned, has a way of getting into your hands if you're not careful. I turned off the lamp. I locked the study door. I went upstairs and lay down in the dark. And this time I didn't try to think about anything at all. I just listened to the house settle around me, the small sounds of old wood and spring wind, and let the night move toward morning on its own. At 7 o'clock, Westcott knocked. I was already downstairs with my jacket on and the door unlocked because there was nothing left to wait for, and I was finished waiting. We began. Amber was in the kitchen when Mitchell left. I heard his car back out of the driveway at 8:40, the same sound I'd heard 100 times, the same pause at the end of the drive before he pulled onto the street. From where I sat at the kitchen table, I could hear Amber moving around upstairs, the soft sounds of a morning routine. The television on low, water running briefly, then footsteps on the stairs. Westcott was at the front door 30 seconds after Mitchell's car turned the corner. I let him in. He nodded once and moved through the front hallway toward the kitchen, and I followed. He had the folder under his arm, the same one he'd had at Herbert's the day before, thicker now, augmented by the pages he'd added since our meeting. He set it on the kitchen table and stood beside it. Amber came into the kitchen and stopped. She was still in her morning clothes, hair pulled back, a coffee mug already in her hand. She looked at Westcott first, then at me, and in the space between those two glances, something changed in her face. Not surprise exactly, something more like the recognition of a thing that has been approaching for a while, and has finally arrived. She knew. I could see that she knew. Whatever composure she'd carried through the past weeks, the easy smile, the morning tea, the perfect warmth, it didn't shatter. It just quietly left the way heat leaves a room when someone opens a window, until what remained was something much smaller and much more real. "Sit down, Amber," Westcott said. His voice was the same tone he used for everything, level, impersonal, not unkind. She sat. He opened the folder and placed the items on the table one at a time, in the order that told the clearest story. The folded paper from Mitchell's drawer, the one with my hourly schedule. The insurance documents original beside the altered version differences annotated in red. The lab report from Covenant Medical, the relevant lines highlighted. The photograph of her and Dominic Reardon at the coffee shop, her leaning forward, one finger raised, entirely at ease with a man whose business was the kind that didn't appear in any registered company filing. And the final page, the records summary. No prenatal appointments, no obstetric intake, no evidence of any kind. She looked at each one. I watched her face move through something complicated, the mug still in both hands, the coffee untouched. A few seconds after the last page was placed, her eyes filled. The tears came without drama, without the performance I might have expected. That more than anything was what I found hardest to read. They looked real. I believed they were real, but I had also believed the tea was kindness, and the schedule was concern, and the pregnancy was a future I was allowed to want. I no longer trusted my own readings. "Tell me," Westcott said. She told him. It came out in pieces at first, then steadier the way water finds its level once the pressure is released. She and Mitchell had borrowed heavily, she said, from Dominic Reardon's operation, over a period of almost 2 years. It had started as something smaller, a short-term loan with a flexible arrangement, the kind of thing that sounds manageable until it compounds into something that isn't. The interest wasn't the kind that appeared on paper. Reardon ran his accounts through pressure rather than contracts, and the pressure had escalated over the past 6 months into something that made her afraid in a way she hadn't known how to talk about. Mitchell came up with the plan, she said. She was looking at the table when she said it, not at me. But I agreed. I helped. She stopped. Every morning, I was the one who prepared it. She didn't say what it was. She didn't need to. Westcott was writing steadily on his legal pad. He asked her questions, dates, names, locations, the specific details of how Reardon's network operated. She answered all of them. She was cooperative in the thorough way of someone who has made a decision and is following it through, trading everything she knew for the chance at something better than what the alternative looked like. The information she gave about Dominic Reardon was, as Westcott confirmed later, exactly the kind of detailed operational intelligence that federal investigators had been building toward for some time. His network extended well beyond Cedar Falls, well beyond Iowa, and Amber had been close enough to its edges to know things that mattered. That cooperation would factor into what came next for her. I sat through all of it without speaking. At some point in the middle of her account, she looked at me directly for the first time. I don't know what she expected to see, accusation maybe, or the particular devastation of a man who had trusted her completely. What I gave her was nothing. Not coldness, not forgiveness, not rage, just my face looking back at hers, waiting for her to finish. Mitchell arrived at 11. Westcott's colleagues had intercepted him at the Collins Road office as planned. He'd denied everything through the first hour, apparently categorically calmly, with the steady composure he'd always had. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubbornness, and he put both of them to use. Then they told him Amber had already given her statement. They brought him to the house at 11, and I was in the front room when he came in. Westcott stood near the doorway. I stood by the window. Mitchell looked older than 31. Not in his face exactly, but in the way he held himself, some quality of ease gone from his posture, replaced by something more guarded, more careful. He met my eyes and didn't look away, which I had not expected, and which made it harder than I had prepared for. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I asked the only question I had. Why Mitchell? He said nothing. He looked at me with those dark eyes, his mother's eyes, the ones that had always been, I thought, the most honest thing about him, and said absolutely nothing. I stood in that silence, and I listened to it. I had expected words, some explanation, something I could argue against or dismiss or try to understand. What I got was absence, and absence turned out to be its own kind of answer. It told me that there was no reason worth saying out loud, that whatever had built to this hadn't come from a wound I could name, or a failure I could point to. It had come from something inside him that had nothing to do with me, nothing to do with Dorothea, nothing to do with the house he'd grown up in or the man who'd raised him. Some things I had thought the night before fracture from the inside. I looked at my son for the last time that morning. "Gogo," I said. 3 words, no one, just the one. He went. The door closed behind him, with the ordinary sound of a door closing, the same sound it made every other day, and the house settled back into its quiet, as if nothing had shifted. Westcott turned from the doorway and looked at me. "You all right?" he asked. I looked at the window. Outside, across the fence, Herbert's peony bush stood where it had always stood. The broken canes from a month ago still visible, but wrapped now in soft ties supported at the fracture points. The new growth pressing up through the base with a stubbornness that didn't care about what had happened to the branches above it. "Do what needs to be done, Frank," I said. He looked at me for one more moment, the look of a man who has been in enough rooms like this to know what useful silence costs. And then he opened his notebook, picked up his pen, and did exactly that. Before we continue, a quick note. Some parts of this story have been shaped with fictional elements for storytelling and reflection. If you're enjoying this, feel free to share it and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if this kind of story isn't for you, this is a good moment to step away. The call came on the 3rd morning. I was at the kitchen table with coffee I hadn't touched, watching the early May light move across the yard. The peony canes next door had put out new shoots over the past week, small, tight, red-green and determined, pushing up from the base with no interest in what had happened to the branches above them. I'd been watching them every morning. There was something in their progress I needed to keep track of, though I couldn't have said exactly why. Westcott said, "There's something you need to know before this moves further. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" I said yes. His office was on Main Street, above a tax preparation firm. A single room with 2 windows facing the street. A desk that held a computer and nothing decorative. 2 chairs positioned across from each other with the frank utility of a space designed for direct conversation. He'd been a police detective for 30 years, and the room reflected that, functional, organized, stripped of anything that didn't serve a purpose. He was already seated when I arrived. A thin folder sat on the desk between us. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at me first, in that measured way. He had the look of a man calibrating how to give someone difficult information, not to soften it, but to make sure they're positioned to receive it. Before the charges in this case move forward, he said, the district attorney's office ran a cross-reference on Mitchell's employment history and insurance activity going back several years. He paused. There was a match. He opened the folder. The man in the photograph was 63 years old. His name was on the folder tab, but I find I don't want to write it here, not because I've forgotten it, but because he deserves more than to be a detail in someone else's account. He had a round, open face with a gray beard and the look of a man who spent time outdoors. He had lived in Des Moines. He had worked in property management for most of his adult life. He had passed away 22 months ago from what the death certificate recorded as sudden cardiac failure. Mitchell had worked for him for 8 months. As a contracted administrative assistant handling scheduling correspondence and financial coordination. 3 months before the man passed, Mitchell had been added to the life insurance policy as a designated beneficiary. The policy paid out 60 days after the certificate was filed. The payment went to an account that had since been closed. No investigation had been opened at the time. There was no reason to open one. The man was 63. He had a history of mild heart irregularities noted in routine checkups, and the end, when it came, had looked like the end that condition eventually produces. It had looked entirely natural. He wasn't the first attempt, Westcott said. He was the first completion. I sat with that. There is a particular kind of silence that comes when something you understood intellectually becomes something you feel. I had known since the lab report what Mitchell had intended. I had known it and processed it, and made the decisions that needed to be made, and kept myself functional through the weeks that followed. I had managed it the way you manage things when there isn't time to do anything else. But the man in the photograph had not been managed. No one had called a retired detective. No one had found a folded paper in a jacket pocket. No one had run a blood panel at Covenant Medical before it was too late. He had been 63 years old with an open face and a gray beard, and he had trusted someone in his house, and he had not made it to 64. I looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then I put it down on the desk, and I pressed both hands flat on the surface, and the grief that came up was not the kind I'd been carrying for weeks. This was something sharper. It wasn't for myself. It wasn't even entirely for Dorothea, or for the version of Mitchell I'd been mourning since April. It was for a man whose name I'd only just learned, whose face I'd never seen before today, whose last months had been spent not knowing what was happening to him. He had been alone in that, in a way, I at least had been spared. The tears came without warning and without much sound. I wasn't a man who wept easily, hadn't been since I was young, and I didn't now, not dramatically. My vision blurred. I looked at the window. I kept both hands on the desk. Westcott said nothing. He didn't shift in his chair, didn't reach for words, didn't look away or pretend to find something to occupy himself with. He just sat across from me and let it move through the room at its own pace, with the quiet steadiness of a man who had sat with grief before and understood that it didn't need managing. After a while, I picked up the photograph again. "What happens now?" I asked. "The Des Moines case is being reopened," he said. "The medical examiner is reviewing the file with the new information, with both cases combined. The prosecution is looking at a sentencing range of 15 to 20 years minimum, and that's before any additional charges related to the financial fraud and Reardon's network." He paused. "Amber's cooperation changes her picture significantly. That process is still being worked through." I nodded. I drove home. The call from Westcott came the following morning at 8:15. He kept it brief. The formal custody process had been completed overnight. The paperwork was filed, and the case was now in the hands of the district attorney's office. There was nothing more for me to do that day. I sat at the kitchen table in the early light and listened to the phone go quiet after he hung up, and I held it in both hands for a moment before setting it down. The coffee was getting cold again. I didn't do anything about it. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light to shift from the pale gray of early morning to something warmer, something that almost felt like the day committing to itself. Long enough for the usual sounds of the neighborhood to come up slowly, a car starting someone's door, the distant bark of a dog that stopped as quickly as it started. I heard Herbert's back door open and close. He appeared at my front door 3 minutes later, still in his housecoat and slippers, which I had never seen him wear outside before, and which told me he had come immediately without stopping. He knocked once and let himself in when I called out, and he came through to the kitchen and sat down across from me without being asked, the way he had been sitting down across from me for weeks now. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't say he was sorry, or that it would be all right, or any of the things people reach for when they don't know what else to offer. He just sat with me in the morning light, the two of us on either side of the kitchen table where so much had happened, and the silence between us was not empty. It was the kind that old houses hold, the kind made of shared time and the particular weight of things already said. We sat like that for a while. Then Herbert looked down at his hands on the table. He turned them over once, the careful gesture of a man thinking something through. "Warren," he said, "would you mind coming to my house for a few minutes?" His voice was the same as always, measured without inflection. But there was something underneath it, something with more weight than an ordinary request. Not urgency exactly, something that had been waiting and was ready now. I looked at him across the table. Let me get my jacket," I said. Herbert's house was not what I'd expected, though I couldn't have said what I had expected. In 20-odd years of living next door, I had seen the outside of it every day. The clean gutters, the window boxes he replanted each spring, the back garden that was his real domain. But I had never stood inside it. Neighbors in Cedar Falls could go that way for decades, close enough to wave from the driveway, far enough that the interior of each other's lives stayed private. We had observed that distance without ever discussing it. He held the door for me and I stepped in. The front room was spare and ordered in a way that felt intentional rather than bare. A single armchair angled toward the window, a side table with a reading lamp, a low shelf of books organized by height, with the patient logic of someone who had arranged them once and saw no reason to change it. There were no photographs on the walls, nothing decorative that I could see, just the clean geometry of a man who had reduced his surroundings to what he needed and found that enough. It was, I realized, not so different from what my own house had become in the 3 years since Dorothea left it. He led me down the short hall to a room at the back, his study smaller than mine, with a single desk facing the window that looked out onto the garden. The peony bush was visible from here. From this angle, with the morning light coming in low, I could see clearly what the weeks of careful tending had done. The broken upper canes were still tied, still supported at their fracture points, but from the crown of the root system, new growth had been pushing steadily upward. 6 new shoots, dark red and dense with stored intention, reaching toward a light they hadn't yet fully reached. Herbert went to the desk. He opened the bottom drawer and took out an envelope. It was the kind of envelope you bought at a drugstore 30 years ago, cream-colored, once the paper gone soft and slightly amber with time. It had been kept carefully, I could see that. No creases except a single fold across the middle. The flap was sealed and had not been opened. He held it out to me. On the front, in handwriting I would have known in the dark, in a hospital, in a burning building, Warren. The W leaned slightly to the left. She had written it that way her entire life. Something in the way she'd first learned the letter as a child. A small leftward habit she never corrected because she never thought it needed correcting. I had watched her sign her name 10,000 times. I had never once mentioned the lean. I took the envelope. She gave it to me about 6 weeks before the end, Herbert said. He stayed near the door, giving me the space of the room without leaving it entirely. She said to hold on to it and give it to you when you needed it most. He paused. I've been waiting for the right time for 3 years. I believe this is it. I sat down in the desk chair. Herbert stood near the doorway and looked out the window, giving me what privacy a small room allows. My hands were not entirely steady. Not from anything physical, the glycoside was long cleared from my system. Dr. Finch had confirmed that. This was something else. The ordinary tremor of being about to hear a voice you have not heard in 3 years, in the handwriting of a woman who knew you well enough to tilt her W's and never bother fixing them. I opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages written on the same cream paper as the envelope in her unhurried hand. She had taken her time with it. The lines were even, the margins generous. The words chosen the way she chose most things, practically without waste but with care underneath the practicality. She wrote about us first. Not romantically, Dorothea was never romantic in the sentimental sense. She wrote the way she talked, direct and warm, like a woman who had decided long ago that the truth was a better gift than decoration. She wrote about the specific texture of a long marriage, the way love, after enough years, stops being the feeling you have and becomes the way you move through a room. The habits you build around another person without noticing the particular ease of being known. She wrote that she had never once, not in 26 years, woken up beside me and wished she were somewhere else. I had to stop and look at the window for a moment after that. Then she wrote about Mitchell. She was careful with it. She wrote that she didn't know what she was seeing, only that something in him had shifted over the past few years. Something she noticed the way you notice a draft before you find the open window. She couldn't name it, she wrote. She had watched and waited, told herself she was wrong, told herself it was the ordinary distance a grown son develops from his parents. But it stayed with her. It had the specific quality of a concern she couldn't argue herself out of. She wrote, "I know you, Warren. I know you will defend him as long as defending him is an option. That's not a flaw. It's part of what makes you a good father and a good man. But it means you need someone watching from an angle you can't see from. I've asked Herbert. He's agreed. Trust him." She wrote that she was sorry she hadn't told me while she still could. She wrote that she had made a calculation. She hadn't wanted me to spend her last months carrying something that might never amount to anything or something she might have been wrong about. She had wanted those months to be what they were. "I was protecting you." She wrote the way you always tried to protect me. "I hope you'll forgive me the same way I always forgave you." And then the last lines, the ones I won't write here, because they were written to me and no one else, and some things belong only to the person they were intended for. I read them twice. Then I folded the letter along its original creases, slid it back into the envelope, and held it in both hands for a moment. Herbert was still near the doorway, looking out the window. "What did she write?" he asked. Not intrusively quietly, the way you ask about something you have some claim to, and aren't sure how much of that claim to press. "She said she loved me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "And she said not to let the garden go." He made a small sound that might have been a response, or might have just been the acknowledgement of a man who already knew both of those things. We sat in the small study as the morning moved around us, the light shifting through the window, the garden outside, doing what it had been doing for weeks, quietly, without asking anything of either of us, working its way back toward what it was supposed to be. I looked at the peony bush through the glass. The broken canes were still there, the damage was real, and it wasn't going to disappear. But below them, rising from the root system, with the patient indifference of something that had survived worse, and knew it, those new shoots pressed upward. 6 of them now, maybe 7, dark red at the base greening as they reached the light. I looked at them for a long time. For the first time since April, since the photographs and the lab report and the envelope from the safe and everything that had come after, for the first time when I looked at that broken, tended, persisting plant, I did not see what Mitchell had done to it. I saw what was still alive underneath. The weeks after Mitchell was taken into custody were the quietest of my life, not peaceful, but hollow. The kind of quiet that comes when everything loud has finally stopped, and you don't yet know what you are without the noise. I functioned. I got up, made coffee, moved through the house. But there was a gap between me and the ordinary surfaces of my days that I couldn't close. I didn't know what face to carry outside, so mostly I stayed in. Herbert never pushed. Every morning between 7 and 7:30, something appeared on my front porch. The first few days it was produce from his garden, early lettuce in a paper bag folded at the top. Then a jar of blackberry preserves I hadn't known he still made. One morning, a sourdough loaf from the bakery on Center Street, Connie's doing. I recognized it, routed through Herbert without ceremony or credit. One morning it was a book. A History of Black Hawk County Settlement and Community, 1840 to 1940. No note. I brought each thing inside and used it. I understood what he was doing. This was how Herbert Caulfield said I am here. Not with presence, not with words. With the small recurring evidence of a man who noticed and provided without making you ask. It was the most Midwestern form of care I'd ever encountered, and it held me together more than anything said out loud could have. The message came on a Thursday afternoon, unfamiliar number, Cedar Falls area code. "Mr. Pendleton? It's Amber. I won't contact you again if you'd rather I didn't. I just need you to know something I couldn't say clearly when Westcott was in the room. I knew about the insurance. I knew what the plan was. I have no excuse for that. But the man in Des Moines, I didn't know about him until the detective's interview. I didn't know there had been someone before you. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just needed you to know I didn't know about him." I read it 3 times. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was drawing one honest line through a lot of dishonesty between what she had known and what she hadn't. And she drew it without softening the parts that were hers. There was something in that I hadn't expected. I typed 2 words, "I know." I sent it and turned the phone face down on the table. Then I looked at Dorothea's photograph on the shelf by the window. The frame I'd brought downstairs the first winter after she passed, because I wanted her in the room where I spent my time. For 3 years, I had been looking at it the way you look at something you're still in conversation with. I reached over and turned it face down, not in grief, not in anger. Something had shifted during those weeks, some quiet movement from waiting for guidance to understanding I would have to find it myself. Her letter was in my desk drawer. What she'd written was inside me now. I didn't need to keep looking outward for the next answer. The house was very quiet. The next morning, I opened the front door before Herbert could set anything down. He was standing on the porch with a bundle of garden twine, which was apparently the day's offering. He looked at me with the measuring patience of a man who doesn't react before he has enough information. "You're up," he said. "I'm up," I said. The early June air was cool and green-smelling, the particular freshness of a Midwest summer just arriving at itself. "Do you want to come look at the peony?" he asked. No weight behind it. No implication about what it meant that I was standing at my own door, instead of waiting for him to leave before collecting what he'd brought. Just a question about a plant. I stepped outside without going back for my jacket. We walked across the yard together through the gap in the fence that Mitchell had left when the post came down, which Herbert had not repaired, and stood in front of the bush. The change was striking. What had been a few tight red-tipped shoots pressing from the root crown had become a proper flush of new growth. The leaves had opened deep green with a reddish cast at the edges, filling in the lower third of the plant, with a density that made the broken upper canes look less like damage and more like old pruning. "It's coming back," Herbert said. Not with satisfaction, not with triumph. The plain, level statement of a man describing what was in front of him. I looked at it without speaking. The neighborhood woke up around us, a car backing out 2 doors down, a dog starting up briefly and stopping. An ordinary Tuesday morning in early June, doing what ordinary mornings do. I didn't move. I wasn't ready to say anything yet. Wasn't sure I had words for what standing here was doing to something inside me that had been very still for a long time. But I stayed. And staying, I had learned recently, was sometimes the whole of what was needed. Westcott called on a Thursday afternoon in June. I was in the kitchen when the phone rang, standing at the counter with a glass of water I hadn't drunk yet, looking out at the yard where the afternoon light was doing something generous with the color of the grass. I had been spending more time outside since the morning Herbert and I stood at the peony bush. Not much more, but some. I picked up on the second ring. His voice was the same as it always was, on the phone level, clear, each piece of information, delivered in its proper order without editorializing. He had news on 3 fronts, he said, and he'd start with the federal case. Dominic Reardon had been taken into federal custody 6 days earlier. The information Amber had provided during her cooperation sessions had been, in Westcott's words, exactly what the investigating team needed to complete a picture they'd been building for some time. Reardon's operation extended across 3 states and involved individuals well beyond Mitchell and Amber. The federal case was now considerably larger than anything that had started on a fence line in Cedar Falls. I listened without interrupting. Mitchell's attorney had negotiated a plea agreement. With both cases combined, Cedar Falls and Des Moines, the sentencing recommendation was 15 years with eligibility for review after 12 given cooperation and conduct. The agreement had been signed the previous week. Amber's situation was different. Her attorney had successfully argued a combination of coercion and substantive cooperation. She had been the first to provide actionable information, and she had done so fully and without conditions. The court had accepted a suspended sentence with 5 years of supervised probation and mandatory restitution. One more thing. Westcott said. Mitchell's attorney contacted me this week. Apparently, Mitchell had been requesting permission to write to you since the first days of his detention. His legal team advised him to wait until the plea agreement was finalized before sending anything. A pause. I'm told the letter was mailed last Tuesday. I thanked him and set the phone down on the counter. I stood there for a while looking at the yard. That evening, I went into the bedroom. I had been avoiding it in the way you avoid a room that holds too much. Not consciously. Not with any decision I remembered making, but in the practical way of a man who finds reasons to sleep on the couch some nights and doesn't examine them too carefully. Everything in there was still the way it had been when Dorothea was alive. Her side of the dresser. The small lamp she'd chosen because the light was warm. The particular way the curtains hung because she'd measured them herself and been precise about it. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room. I wasn't ready to change any of it, but I thought I could start coming back in. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-July. I found it when I brought in the paper, a standard white envelope Cedar Falls postmark return address, printed in the small institutional font of official correspondence M. Pendleton Blackhawk County Correctional Facility. I carried it inside. I set it on the kitchen table and sat down across from it, the way you sit across from something you're not sure how to approach. The handwriting on the front was Mitchell's. I recognized it before I consciously registered what I was looking at. That particular slant, the way he formed his capital P, the slight crowding of letters toward the right side of available space. I had watched that handwriting develop from the uncertain printing of a third grader practicing on lined paper at this same table. I sat with it for a long time. I picked it up, turned it over, set it down again. Picked it up once more, held it for a moment, feeling the slight weight of however many pages were inside. And then I got up and went to the desk in the hallway and opened the top drawer and placed it inside face up, so the handwriting wasn't the first thing I'd see the next time I opened it. I went back to the kitchen and stood at the window. Herbert came over that evening without being asked. He had developed over the months an informal sense of when company was needed that required no explanation from either of us. He came through the back door the way he'd started doing after I left it unlocked for him one afternoon, and neither of us made note of it. He saw the envelope on the table immediately. I'd left it there after dinner, moved it from the drawer, not entirely sure why. He glanced at it once, then at me, then crossed to the counter and poured coffee into the 2 mugs I kept on the right side of the cabinet, the way he'd learned I kept them. He sat down. The envelope sat between us on the table. Neither of us referred to it directly. We talked about the peony. It had put out 8 new shoots, now the foliage full enough that Herbert had begun removing the support ties from the lower canes, letting them bear their own weight. We talked about the weather, which had turned hot the way Iowa summers do in July, heavy and insistent. Connie had mentioned something about a neighborhood gathering in August that neither of us had decided about yet. At some point the coffee was finished. I picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, and then walked to the kitchen drawer, the one beside the stove, the one I used for the ordinary things, and placed it inside. I did not turn the small latch. Herbert watched me do it. I turned back and met his eyes across the kitchen, and he gave me the look of a man who had seen a thing and understood it, and was not going to attach any words to it. We washed the mugs together in the sink. He let himself out the back, and I heard his footsteps cross the yard in the warm July dark. I stood at the sink for a moment. The drawer was closed. The latch was open. And somehow that small mechanical fact, the difference between shut and locked, felt like the most honest thing I'd managed in a long time. The heat in Cedar Falls in July is a different animal from the cold of March. In March, the cold is clean. It has edges, it behaves predictably, you dress for it, and it leaves you alone. The July heat is something else. It settles into the house by mid-morning and stays thick and close, turning the air inside to something you move through rather than breathe. By evening, it hadn't broken. The fan in the bedroom pushed it around without reducing it. I couldn't sleep. At some point past 11, I got up. Went to the study and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Not the one with Mitchell's envelope, the other one, on the left side, and took out a yellow legal pad and a pen. I hadn't used this desk for anything beyond storing papers since I'd retired. Dorothea used to say, I worked better under pressure than I thought I did, which was her way of noting that I avoided starting things until I couldn't avoid them anymore. I sat down and put the pen to the paper. I didn't plan what I was going to write. I just began. Mitchell, I don't know if I'm writing this for you or for myself. Maybe both. Maybe it doesn't matter yet. Were you happy? Not recently? Not in the years when whatever this was had already started. I mean before. When you were young and we lived in this house together and your mother was alive. Were you happy then? Or have I been carrying a version of you that only existed in my understanding of you and not in yours? I wrote for a long time. The fan turned. The night outside the window went from the blue dark of late evening to the flat black of real night, and I kept writing. I asked him when it started not to assign blame, but because I genuinely didn't know, and not knowing felt like its own kind of wound. I wrote about the boy. I remembered the one who had cried without shame the morning after Dorothea passed, who had learned to ride a bike in the driveway of this house by refusing to quit, who had called me every Sunday for 3 years after he moved out, because he said it helped him feel like the week had a shape. I asked him if I had missed something I should have seen. I wrote that honestly, not to absolve myself, not to shift weight, but because it was the question I couldn't put down. I had been his father for 31 years. A father is supposed to see. I hadn't. I don't know if that makes me responsible for what you chose. I don't think it does. But I've been sitting with the question anyway, because it seems like the kind of thing a person should sit with rather than dismiss. I wrote until the legal pad had used up most of its pages. By then, the heat had thinned slightly, not enough to be comfortable, but enough to suggest the possibility of mourning. I folded the pages together, all of them, and held the stack for a moment. Then I went to the bookshelf and took down the small wooden box Dorothea had kept on her side of the bedroom, the one she'd used for letters and cards she wanted to keep. A plain cedar box with a brass clasp that she'd found at a market years ago. I had moved it to the study after she passed, because I couldn't look at it in the bedroom yet. I put the folded pages inside and closed the clasp. On the shelf beside the box, I set the photograph of Dorothea upright again. It had been face down for weeks. I looked at her face for a moment, turned slightly the way she always was in photographs, and then I went to bed and slept until the sun was high. In the morning, I went to Herbert's. The peony was our project, now mine and Herbert's, in the informal way that things become shared, without anyone declaring them so. He had been tending it alone for 30 years. Since April, he had let me participate, and since June, I had started arriving without being asked. That morning, he showed me the new root growth along the base, thin white threads, visible just below the soil line, where he'd pulled the mulch back carefully with 2 fingers. New feeder roots extending outward from the crown, seeking purchase in the soil beyond the original planting zone. He showed me how to water at the base rather than overhead, how to let the hose run slow and low, so the soil absorbed rather than ran. He showed me how to distinguish the yellow at the edge of a leaf that meant too little water from the yellow that spread from the center and meant something else. He taught the way he did everything, without hurrying, without explaining beyond what was needed, pausing between steps to let the information find its place. At some point, while we were both crouched near the base of the plant, he said, without looking up from what he was doing, Dorothea used to say that caring for a garden is like caring for a relationship. He turned a leaf gently in his fingers to check the underside. She said you can't force it to grow. You can only make sure it has what it needs and then be patient. I looked at the plant in front of me. The damage from April was still visible. The place on the main cane where the fence post had struck it had healed into a raised, rough seam. Not invisible, not something that would smooth over with time into something you couldn't find if you knew to look. The scar was part of the plant now incorporated into its structure, a permanent record of one morning's accident. But the cane was strong. It bore the new growth without bending. I stayed until mid-morning, then walked back across the yard to my own house. In the kitchen, I stopped and looked at the drawer beside the stove. I didn't open it. I just stood there and looked at it. The way you look at something, you're still in the process of deciding about not avoiding it, not ready for it, but no longer pretending it wasn't there. Then I looked out the window. The afternoon was still hours away, but the light had already taken on that warm, weighted quality of an Iowa summer evening, arriving early, turning the yard amber and slow. The peony was visible over the fence line, its foliage dense now, the broken upper canes still bearing the scars of April, but holding steady under the weight of all that new green. Something was shifting in me. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the air confirms it. Something moving toward something slow and certain, working its way through without being hurried, like a root finding its direction in the dark. September arrived the way it always does in Cedar Falls, not with announcement, but with a gradual shift in the quality of light and air that you notice first at the edges of things. The maple at the corner of the yard had begun to turn at the tips of its highest branches, the green going soft and uncertain before committing to something warmer. The mornings carried a coolness that the afternoon still burned off, but you could feel winter thinking about it in the shadows. I had started sleeping with the bedroom window open again. It wasn't a decision I made consciously. I simply stopped closing it one night, and then kept not closing it, letting the night air move through the room the way it used to when Dorothea was alive, and she would pull the extra blanket up and complain in the morning that I'd let the house get cold. I didn't mind the cold. I was sleeping better than I had in years. One evening in the first week of September, I sat at the study desk without a specific reason to be there. I had been reading earlier, but the book was on the side table in the living room. I had come to the study the way you drift sometimes toward a room that holds something unfinished. I sat down and looked at the drawer beside the stove, then remembered I was in the study and looked instead at the drawer on the right side of the desk. I opened it. The envelope was where I'd placed it 2 months ago, face up, the handwriting visible. I picked it up and held it. What was different this time was the absence of the pull in both directions, the simultaneous urge to open it and to put it away that had made the thing so difficult before. That tension was quieter now. I held the envelope and let my thumb move across the return address, across Mitchell's name printed in the institutional font, across the stamp in the upper corner. I turned it over, looked at the sealed flap. Then I set it on the surface of the desk, in the circle of light from the lamp, and left it there. I didn't open it, but I didn't put it back. I went to bed and left the lamp on low, and the envelope sat in that small pool of light in the empty room, and for the first time, it didn't feel like something I was avoiding. It felt like something I was approaching from a direction, and at a pace I was choosing myself. The following afternoon, Herbert called and asked if I wanted to sit on his porch. He had put out 2 chairs facing the garden, old wooden chairs, repainted at some point, in a deep green that had faded to something more honest over the years. There was a small table between them, and on the table a pot of tea and 2 plain white cups. He poured without asking. I reached for the cup and picked it up. The tea was an herbal blend, something light and warm, the kind that smells faintly of dried flowers. I lifted it and drank without pausing, without running any calculation in the back of my mind, without the particular vigilance that had become part of every meal and drink for months. It was the first time since February that I had taken something from another person's hands without bracing. I don't think Herbert noticed. Or if he did, he had the grace not to mark it. We sat and looked at the peony. The plant had changed again with the season. The foliage had deepened from the fresh green of summer into the richer, more complex color of early autumn, the leaves taking on a reddish bronze at the edges, the whole bush fuller than it had been before April, the new growth from the base having added a density the plant hadn't carried before the accident. The healed section of the main cane was visible still, the raised seam of repair that would always be there. But the cane itself stood straight, bearing the weight of the season without accommodation. "It's stronger now," Herbert said. He was looking at the plant with the frank appreciation of a man who had been watching it for 30 years and knew exactly what he was seeing. The break forced it to grow differently. More roots, more lateral canes. "It's sturdier than it was before." I looked at the healed seam. "You're not only talking about the plant," I said. "Oh no," he said. "I'm not." We sat with that for a while, the tea going from hot to warm in our hands. The afternoon light doing what September light does in Iowa, turning everything it touches a shade more golden than it actually is, as if the season is trying to be generous before it goes. After a comfortable stretch of quiet, the kind that exists between people who no longer need to fill the air between them, Herbert said, without turning his head from the garden. "You know, I've been thinking. I believe Dorothea sent you to me, not the other way around." I looked at him. "I had been alone for a long time," he said simply. "Longer than I'd admitted to myself. She knew that. She would have known that." He turned his cup in his hands. "I think she saw what the two of us might be to each other, before either of us could see it." I thought about the man who had stood at my door at 10 o'clock on a March night, hat in hand coat buttoned, having made a decision. The man who had left a history of Black Hawk County on my porch with no explanation, who had sat across from me in his kitchen while I read her letter and looked out the window and gave me the room to feel what I needed to feel. "Maybe she sent us to each other," I said. He considered that, gave a small nod the way he acknowledged things that seemed right to him. The light was going amber now, the yard settling into the early evening quiet of a neighborhood winding down. Somewhere down the street, a screen door closed. The maple at the corner showed more red in its upper branches than it had that morning. I finished my tea. I walked back across the yard in the cooling air through the fence gap that had never been repaired, and that I suspected now never would be, and into my house. In the study, the desk lamp was still on. The envelope was still where I had left it in the circle of light, face up, Mitchell's handwriting, visible from the doorway. I stood and looked at it for a moment. Then I left it there and went to make dinner. October came to Cedar Falls the way it always does all at once, as if the season had been waiting just off stage and finally decided it had been patient long enough. I woke to the sound of wind in the oak tree, the particular dry rustling of leaves that have committed to letting go. The light through the bedroom window was different from September's lower, more golden, the kind that hits at an angle and makes ordinary things look briefly significant. I lay there for a moment and listened to the house around me, the small sounds of a morning beginning. Then I got up and went downstairs to make coffee. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner. Took one mug from the cabinet, the left side where I kept them now, the way Herbert had learned to find them. Then I paused. I reached back and took out a second one. I want to be clear about why. Not because I'd forgotten, not out of the old muscle memory that used to set 2 cups down before I'd thought about it. This was different. I set the second mug on the counter with the deliberateness of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and has decided to do it because Herbert would be over around 8, the way he'd been coming over on October mornings since the weather turned, and because I wanted the coffee ready when he arrived. 3 years ago, the second cup was an absence. This morning, it was an expectation. I carried them both out to the porch and sat down. Cedar Falls in October is a particular kind of beautiful, the unsentimental, almost aggressive beauty of a place that knows the color won't last. The maples along the street had gone fully red overnight, the kind of red that has nothing subtle about it. Deep and saturated, almost unreasonable, the color of something burning cleanly. The oak tree in the yard had gone gold. The light came through all of it at a low angle and turned the whole street into something that belonged on a postcard nobody bothered to make, because you'd have to be standing in it to understand. Ite. I sat with my coffee and looked at it and didn't try to hold on to it. Herbert came at 8, same as he had been. He came around the side of the house through the fence gap, which had grown so habitual now that neither of us thought about it, and stopped when he saw the second mug on the small table between the chairs. He sat down without comment and picked it up. We looked at the peony. The plant had changed again with the month. The foliage had gone the deep reddish bronze of late autumn, the leaves beginning to curl slightly at the edges with the dry air. The new growth from the base. All those shoots that had pressed up through spring and summer with such indifference to what had happened above them had matured into proper canes now, thicker than I would have expected, after one season standing with the quiet authority of things that had earned their place. The healed seam on the main cane caught the morning light. From this angle at this hour, it did something I hadn't noticed before. The raised tissue of the repair reflected the low sun differently than the smooth bark around it, giving it a faint brightness. Not a flaw catching the light. Something more like a feature. "It's stronger now," I said. Herbert looked at me. "A beat." Yes," he said. "It is." We drank our coffee in the comfortable silence of men who no longer need to fill the space between them. Somewhere down the block, a car pulled out of a driveway. A few leaves came down from the oak in a gust, spinning past the porch railing, in no particular hurry. After a while I stood up. I went inside down the hall into the study. The envelope was on the desk where I'd left it the night before in the lamp's circle of light face up. I picked it up, and this time there was nothing complicated about the act of holding it. It was just an envelope. Heavy paper, Mitchell's handwriting, a stamp in the corner. A thing a person had written and sent across a distance. I carried it out to the porch. Herbert watched me come back through the door. His eyes went to the envelope, then to my face, then back to the garden. He didn't say anything. I sat down. I held the envelope in both hands and looked at it at the return address. Pendleton, Black Hawk County Correctional Facility, at the name printed above it. The name I had given him. The handwriting I had watched develop from uncertain third-grade printing at the kitchen table inside this house. I turned it over, looked at the sealed flap. I thought about the boy in the camping photograph. Both arms stretched wide, one hand in mine, one in Dorothea's, grinning with the full confidence of a child who believed the people holding him would always be there. I thought about the man in Westcott's photographs, leaning forward across a table in a coffee shop, relaxed and deliberate. I tried, as I had many times, to find the line between those two people, and as always, I couldn't find it. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe the line was the whole story, too long and too complicated to trace from where I was standing. I set the envelope on the small table between the chairs. Then I picked up my coffee mug and placed it on top of the envelope, gently, squarely holding it, flat against the wood, so the October wind coming through the porch railing couldn't take it. Herbert looked at the mug sitting on top of the envelope. He looked at me. "Not today," I said quietly. "But maybe someday." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he gave one slow nod, the same nod he gave to things that seemed right to him, and turned back to the garden. We sat there as the morning moved around us. The light shifted. More leaves came down. The peony stood in Herbert's yard, with its healed cane catching the sun, its new growth dense and settled. The whole plant more substantial now than it had been before the morning. A fence post fell on it and changed everything. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about the March morning 7 months ago, when I had sat on this same porch with 2 cups and an ache I'd learned to call ordinary. I thought about everything that had moved through this house since then. The fear, the grief, the particular education of discovering that the people you trust most completely are still, in the end, people, capable of things you can't prepare for. I thought about Herbert showing up at my door at 10 o'clock at night because he had given a dying woman his word. I thought about Dorothea, who had seen something I hadn't and had loved me enough to make arrangements. The envelope was still on the table under my coffee cup. The seal was still unbroken. I was 58 years old, sitting on my front porch in Cedar Falls, Iowa, on an October morning that was more beautiful than it had any right to be. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was looking at what was still here, the gold in the oak tree, the red in the maples, the man sitting in the chair beside me, the healed plant in the morning sun, the unlocked drawer inside, the letter waiting at its own pace for a day I hadn't chosen yet. It was enough. I was beginning to understand more than enough. That's my story. All of it, the parts I'm proud of and the parts I'm not. I was a father who loved his son so completely that I made loving him into a kind of blindness. I saw what I wanted to see. I filled in the gaps with the best version of him and called it faith. Don't be like me in that way. Love your family with your eyes open. Family Story teaches us this over and over, and we keep forgetting. If I could tell you one thing I learned from all of this, it's that trust is not the same as attention. You can trust someone and still pay attention. You can love someone and still ask hard questions. The two things are not opposites. I also learned that God doesn't always protect you from the hard road. Sometimes He just makes sure the right people are standing on it with you. Herbert Caulfield Gon Kwanha, Toi Luk Moi Gio Gem. That was not coincidence. That was grace. These grandpa stories are never just about the old man in the chair. They're about what a life actually looks like when you stop editing it. The beautiful parts and the broken ones. The healed seams that catch the light. If you're sitting somewhere right now carrying a family story, you haven't told anyone a question you're afraid to ask. Don't wait as long as I did. The drawer doesn't have to stay locked. This has been one of my grandpa stories, and I'm still here to tell it. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. If you found yourself in Warren's position, a parent facing something unthinkable within your own family story, I'd genuinely love to know what you would have done differently. Drop it in the comments. Every perspective matters here. If this story moved something in, you consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. One small note. While this narrative draws from real human experiences and social themes, certain elements have been shaped for storytelling purposes. If this style of grandpa stories isn't your thing, no hard feelings, there's something for everyone on this channel.